Well, hello everybody. I hope you all are doing well today. Now, I signed this on April 7th, so I'm hoping you watch on April 7th, and that is when your assignment connected with it is due. One of the things I want you to do in the assignment that I didn't put on there is I'm not going to be sharing a this day in history or a famous birthday today. What I want on your assignment for the notes here is for you to tell me one important event that happened on this day in history, April 7th, and to tell me one birthday of a famous person that happened on this day in history, April 7th. So that's two of the things you can do to obviously tell me that you watched the video, and two answers you can put on there. It's easy, just Google search and you can find a lot of things. Just choose one, however, don't give me a bunch of this days in history or birthdays. Choose one, whichever one you think is the most important. So we're going to continue with chapter 23, and we're going to begin to look at Eisenhower's time as president. We've already looked at Truman's time as president, and we're going to begin looking at Eisenhower. Now, interestingly, this part of the chapter will probably go a little bit faster, and JFK's part will go fairly fast too, considering he didn't serve as long as these other two guys, who basically both served 2 terms. But Eisenhower, probably the reason it will go a little shorter with Eisenhower is not because he didn't do a good job. It's because there wasn't as much international conflict. Not that there wasn't any, but it wasn't as bad during his time period. So it tended to be a little bit more peaceful during his time period. So the first thing we're going to look at is the election of 1952. Republicans could basically sense that victory was at hand if they could just run the right candidate. Harry Truman, once again, was pretty unpopular, and he wasn't rerunning this time around. One of the options was Senator Robert A. Taft from Ohio. He was a conservative. He was one option, but there began to be this effort to try to draft Eisenhower to run as the Republican candidate. He had kind of stated that he didn't want to run, but with the Korean War waging in Asia, the Soviets having the atomic bomb, Stalin's attempt to starve West Berlin, people were looking for someone who could maybe bring a sense of calm. And certainly Ike, who is a nickname for Dwight Eisenhower, certainly Eisenhower provided a calming presence by being a part of NATO. So it was kind of seen that he possibly could be the right person for this job. On top of that, he was extremely popular at this point in time. So he was in France, however, working with NATO when they begin this election cycle of 1952. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts begins the draft Eisenhower effort. Eisenhower won the New Hampshire primary as a write-in candidate. Okay, so imagine that. Imagine we go into the primaries. Let's just use this year. Obviously, we'll use Democrats as an example. But imagine, you had Bernie Sanders, had Joe Biden, and Elizabeth Warren. And you remember the list of people who was running when they started in New Hampshire. And imagine somebody who's not even on the ballot wins. Okay, well, that's what happened for Eisenhower here. He was angry. He was saying he was not seeking the party nomination. However, he didn't make a definitive statement like William Tecumseh Sherman. Some of you guys remember that you did this in your presentation over Sherman when you guys did the generals from the Civil War. But Sherman made a statement about running for president. He said, quote, "If nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve." So that's a very definitive statement. Eisenhower never made a statement quite like that. And it becomes apparent that more and more people want him to run. It seems like he has a good chance of winning. And Eisenhower hadn't made up his mind, but Senator Robert Taft, who was the other main candidate for the Republicans, he actually was a friend of Eisenhower's, but he was suggesting that the United States withdraw all their troops from Europe and to basically take them out, because America had left some troops in Europe after World War II to maintain peace. Eisenhower saw this as a terrible move, that the Soviet Union then would dominate and take over even more areas. So Eisenhower decides to get himself into the race. Now, Eisenhower never had actually been a part of a political party. Like he had never declared that he was a Democrat or Republican, never registered as either one for voting purposes either. But it did seem like he was primarily a Republican. He was opposed to big government. He was pretty opposed to high taxes. He was very strong on his stance against communism. Now, the Democrats during this time period were fairly strong on their stance against communism too, but the Republicans were even stronger. So it seemed like he was a good fit. Now, uh, when they get to the Republican National Convention in 1952 in Chicago, there is no clear-cut winner. In fact, this is something from back when we did American Government last year. If you remember, the primary process that we have now wasn't really in place until a little bit later. Now, there were some primaries. We just talked about the New Hampshire primary here, but people typically didn't get to the national convention with enough votes to guarantee they were going to be the candidate. So you come into this convention, and Eisenhower seems to be the front runner, but he also is not 100% guaranteed. However, he did have an influential group behind him of Eastern Republicans led by Thomas Dewey, who had been a governor of New York and had also been the presidential candidate in 1944 and 1948. He backs Eisenhower. And very instrumental in making sure Eisenhower gets elected is Richard Nixon. He really helped ensure Eisenhower was nominated as the Republican candidate by doing this. California was wanting to put their votes for the candidate behind Earl Warren, who eventually becomes a Supreme Court justice. And he was from California. That's why they wanted to put their votes behind Earl Warren. But Richard Nixon, who was also from California, convinces the delegates from California to put their votes behind Eisenhower, and that allows Eisenhower to be nominated. On top of that, Richard Nixon then gets named as the vice presidential candidate in return for working to get Eisenhower nominated. I'm going to go through who the Democrats run in a little bit, but I do want to say that Eisenhower, despite the fact that he was kind of reluctant to become a candidate, does do a large amount of campaigning. He had a infectious smile, just a positive presence about himself, and he went on a whistle-stop tour on the train and recorded over 51,000 miles, more than doubling Truman's 21,000 miles that he did in 1948. So he gives speeches all over America. Now, the Democrats run Adlai Stevenson, who was a governor of Illinois. He was not connected to Truman, so that was important to the Democrats. They didn't want to choose someone who was too connected to Truman because, like I said, at this point in time, Truman was fairly unpopular. Once again, he was really a liberal intellectual within the Democratic Party. He was pretty witty, urban, a city man. In many ways, however, he was an odd choice. He wasn't as strong as Truman on civil rights or labor issues. He didn't have any far-reaching economic program to push. However, he did disdain Richard Nixon, who a lot of the Democrats did during this time period, and felt that Nixon was a crooked politician. Interestingly, obviously that will turn out to be somewhat true when Nixon becomes president. Many years from here, though, we're talking about 20 years later, Nixon would be president. One of the things, too, about Adlai Stevenson is that he may have been the first to break from the tradition of generally trying not to look superior or flaunt your superiority to the average voter. When asked why he seemed to talk over the heads of his listeners, that's a quote, over the heads of his listeners, he replied, quote, "I speak to where their heads ought to be. Like, I'm speaking of such high important things that these people should be on my level." Generally, political parties try not to flaunt their sense of superiority, or a candidate tries not to do that. It tends not to go well. One of the things that Eisenhower says on the campaign trail is, "I shall go to Korea." That doesn't mean I shall go to Korea and fight in a war. It means I want to go. I want to work a deal to try to end the Korean War. So that was a pretty popular opinion too. Now, the Korean War was not hated nearly as much as the Vietnam War was. there wasn't a lot of anti-war sentiment. At the same time, most Americans were tired of the Korean War and wanted to get out. It didn't have the same clear-cut objective as, say, World War I and World War II. So as the war drug on, people were less likely to um, be on board with that. Now, Eisenhower wins in a landslide. Um, he wins 442 electoral votes. Stevenson wins 89 electoral votes. He beat Stevenson by over 10% on the popular vote, 10% of the people, which equals about 6.5 million more people voted for Eisenhower than voted for Stevenson. So a pretty easy win. One of the criticisms Eisenhower had is a lot of people said he lacked experience in politics. And that is partially true. I mean, he had never served in a political office, but as a general during World War II and as the head of NATO, he had operated in a political sphere, meeting with leaders like Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Marshall, Charles de Gaulle from France, even Soviet military leaders he had met with, and he knew a lot of these people on a personal basis. So as far as foreign policy, he had a lot of experience in dealing with issues. So he actually seemed to be highly qualified for the job he was about to take on. He also was highly approachable. People really liked him. That's why it says, "I like Ike." That was his campaign slogan, a campaign slogan that helped get him elected. Now, as he comes in, Eisenhower wasted no time in keeping his campaign pledge to go to Korea. So he actually traveled in November of 1952, which is before he even takes office as president, to get an assessment of the military situation there. Um, so Eisenhower went there. As divisive as the Korean War was, like I said, there was no anti-American sentiment in the United States within popular entertainment, like there would be with the Vietnam War and with, in a lot of ways, future wars. Eisenhower took the oath of office January 20th, 1953, and he, while taking the oath and giving his speech, he led the nation in prayer, saying these words: "Give us, we pray, the power to discern clearly right from wrong, and allow our words and actions to be governed thereby, and by all the law of this land. Especially we pray that our concerns shall be for all the people, regardless of station, race, or calling." Cynics were quick to point out after he gave this speech that he had never joined a church prior to coming to the White House, but he'd also, like we already said, never joined a political party either. Young evangelist Billy Graham did not agree with the cynic's viewpoint. Graham actually knew Eisenhower well. Eisenhower invited him to come to Paris, where they were working at the supreme headquarters of the Allied powers Europe, which is SHAPE. Eisenhower had even invited the young evangelical leader to come to a Chicago hotel when he was nominated for president and advise him on his acceptance speech. In fact, Billy Graham recalled that Dwight Eisenhower was a very religious man. So Eisenhower, strong Christian values. Billy Graham saw him as a strong Christian leader. Many changes we put into the moral rearmament to meet the threat of atheistic communism. And this is what Eisenhower begins calling for: moral rearmament. And that basically a society that has a God would be going primarily against a society that does not acknowledge God. And that would be the communists in the Soviet Union. So it did become partly Christianity versus atheism in the minds of some individuals, including Eisenhower himself. In fact, Eisenhower famously added a very famous phrase to the Pledge of Allegiance. The Knights of Columbus of Catholics Men Group had been lobbying tirelessly to have these words acted, but it was because of Eisenhower's backing that Congress complied and added the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. So it is due to Dwight Eisenhower primarily that the words "under God" are within the Pledge of Allegiance today. On March 5th, 1953, the Kremlin announced the death of Joseph Stalin. It is not clear today even exactly how Stalin died. Some say Nikita Khrushchev, who became the next leader, next premier, actually killed him. Although the more prevalent idea is that he died due to doctors not giving him care. Now, this could be because Nikita Khrushchev told them not to give him care. It also could be because the doctors were afraid if they messed up, Stalin would have them killed. Some of the important doctors here that would be serving Khrushchev were Jewish doctors, and the Jewish people had been treated terribly by Stalin. So they probably didn't want to get near him. They were terrified of him. In fact, there was a young boy whose father was a doctor who recalled his father sending him to a Moscow kindergarten. This is the day after Stalin died. That morning, he was given stern instructions by his father that when other children cry, you cry. When they write poems to praise Stalin, you write them too. Never reveal the joy that seized the hearts of millions of Soviet Jews in the crowded apartments. So many people were celebrating the death of Stalin. Uh, Once again, you see that the Jewish people were targeted, unfortunately, not just by Germans in the Holocaust, but here by the Soviets, who had been persecuting them since the late 1800s, before the Nazis even persecuted them. Um, Here at home, Eisenhower's presented the horrible decision when he was president to allow the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Now, they were part of the plot to share the atomic secrets with the Soviet Union. Um, the Trump administration had prosecuted the Rosenbergs, and Eisenhower has the choice to either continue to allow their execution or to grant them clemency, which doesn't mean they would just be let go, but maybe to put them in jail instead. World figures like the Pope during this time period, Pius VII and Albert Einstein, appealed to the new president to not have them executed. Leftists around the world accused Eisenhower of anti Semitism because Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Jewish people. Um, Communist novelist Howard Fast wrote of the stale smell of fascism when he detected around Eisenhower by the Jewish masses of our country. So here you go. We had Truman. We talked about Reagan being called a fascist. Here, Eisenhower is being called a fascist, and he's being called someone who's anti-Jew. This is crazy. Eisenhower was not anti-Semitic. In fact, it was Eisenhower who helped liberate many Jewish people from Nazi control at the end of World War II. And he was the one who actually ordered army filmmakers to record the terrible conditions and all of the dead bodies and all of the people who survived the Holocaust. He was the one who required the army to do that so that later on no one could disavow and no one could deny what had happened to the Jewish people. So clearly he is not anti-Semitic. This is clearly fake news. Fake news, guys, fake news being reported here. Clearly because communists tend to spread fake news and not to spread truth. President Eisenhower was able to announce the ceasefire in Korea on July 27th, 1953. However, and you notice it says ceasefire. This does not say peace agreement. There's never been an actual peace agreement between North and South Korea. They have just kept the ceasefire since July 27th, 1953 to this day. But it really did draw the line where there already had been the line drawn before between North and South Korea. So once again, this war was about containment. They didn't really end communism in Korea, but they also didn't allow it to expand to South Korea. So it kind of, by the time the war is over, obviously 36 million Americans died, 600,000 Chinese died, over 2 million North Koreans and South Koreans died. But still, by the end of the war, it was kind of the way it was before the war even began. Things went back to the way they were. Well, in America, there was a man named Joseph McCarthy. He was a senator from Wisconsin, staunch anti-communist, which, hey, I applaud that part. That's about it, because we're going to mostly say negative things about Joseph McCarthy. I do applaud that he's a staunch anti-communist. But the way he went about trying to end communism was what was the issue. Eisenhower knew that McCarthy thrived on publicity. he even basically said that it was like oxygen to a fire, that he relied upon, like the publicity, upon being in the news. He was kind of an egomaniac, Joseph McCarthy was. Eisenhower said, I really believe that nothing will be so effective in combating his particular kind of troublemaking as to ignore him. This he cannot stand. So maybe it'd have been better if people ignored McCarthy, but he made it really hard. Ignored. He accused a wide variety of people of being communists. He even charged the military, trying to drag the army before the committee in the government, proving that there were communists in the military, which Eisenhower obviously has a strong tie to the military and has a love for the military. Um, he also investigated a left-wing dentist at Fort Monmouth in New Jersey. This would be a military dentist. And was the good dentist putting radioactive fillings in the GI's teeth so the communists could maybe trace them onto the battlefield? Maybe that was one of those crazy stories, the type of things that McCarthy would say. Um, McCarthy was ridiculed by he was a Republican, but he was ridiculed by Democrats and Republicans alike. I mean, there were some people on his side, but most people really saw him as someone who was very over the top. He sent some young staff members to funded to Europe, sniffing out any subversive literature at U.S. funded libraries. Okay, the president Eisenhower, at a commencement address at Dartmouth, denounced the book burners, and he was clearly talking about these two young men who were sent by McCarthy to Europe, that they basically were trying to sniff out any communism in any type of way. Like I said, McCarthy really craved attention. He constantly badgered witnesses. His unstable personal conduct and his general recklessness was his undoing. He was a heavy drinker. He was someone who was known to make statements that were really ridiculous. McCarthy's supporters were set to go after Ralph Bunche, if you remember him, the Nobel Peace Prize winner who helped bring peace between Israel and Arab nations, at least a temporary peace. He was being accused of being a communist. In the end, Bunche told the White House that he would handle the case alone. He testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee and was able to acquit himself pretty easily. Eisenhower always thought McCarthy was more interested in hunting headlines than in catching communists. Eisenhower knew that basically if you give a man a rope, he'll hang himself. And that's what ends up happening with McCarthy. In this case, him being on TV so much is kind of what ended his career. Eventually, because of all of the things McCarthy was doing, he was censured by the Senate by an overwhelming vote, 67 to 22. Now, a censure is an official written in writing denouncement of what a person has been doing and saying. It doesn't happen very often. Basically, it's a strong reprimand. It doesn't really, remove anybody, but it's such a strong thing to do. It shows the disdain people have for you, and especially to have it happen by such a large number. 3 years later, after he was censured in 1954, still drinking heavily, Joe McCarthy died. He was only 49 at the time. An author, Michael Barone, writes this about McCarthy, and this will help you answer one of the questions from your assignment: how did McCarthy do more harm than good? So here is what it says: utterly unscrupulous, untethered to any truth, unhampered by any sense of fairness, and undisciplined by any desire to accomplish a concrete goal. That's the end of that quote, but I still want to read a little bit from this book I'm using here. Worst of all, McCarthy besmirched the honorable cause of anti-communism. He discredited legitimate efforts to counter Soviet subversion. From this point on, it would only be necessary for disloyal people to yell McCarthyism to distract public attention from real problems. So in the long run, McCarthy does a lot more harm than good. It's kind of like the boy that cried wolf, or the sky is falling. The sky is falling now. If the sky is falling, like in the Chicken Little movie, then I guess it's a good thing. But you cry communism so many times and it's proven it's not to be communist. Later on, when people find real communist threats, oftentimes those people were not taken seriously. So he actually did more harm than good. Uh, there still were some communists in the country, and there definitely were spies. But now, anytime someone was accused of being a communist, people would just invoke McCarthy's name and accuse people of being bigots and being terrible people. And then the people would kind of have to shut up because Joseph McCarthy did such a poor job trying to take down communism. All right, before we close today, because this will be the last of this lecture today, I have one more question I want you to answer on your assignment. It's a very easy one. You can't get it wrong. What is your favorite color? Yes, you heard me right. What is your favorite color? Mine's blue. I also really like purple, but it's not my favorite. I like orange just because I'm a Broncos fan. But to be honest, I like blue. You can probably tell I wear a lot of blue clothes. So, what is your favorite color? Put that as your last answer on your notes, and obviously send those in to me by the end of the day on the 7th. Hope you guys are all doing well, and we will. Be getting another thing of notes on Thursday. So we'll see you then.